Congressman Seth Moulton, and now I'm quoting from the New York Times, has repeatedly played the role of party agitator. He unseated an incumbent Democrat a decade ago, tried to topple Representative Nancy Pelosi from the House speakership, and mounted a quixotic run for president in 2019, which arguably gained less attention than his recent comments on Democrats needing to speak normally to appear normal to normal Americans. Now, I am not going to choose to give him an introduction that's laden with insults, snuck in using the word arguably. So I will just say Seth Moulton won re-election to Massachusetts' 6th congressional district. He served 4 tours in Iraq, earning a Bronze Star, engaging in multiple combat operations. He has a business and an undergraduate degree in physics from Harvard. Welcome to the Gist, Congressman Moulton.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, the New York Times loves to be snarky.
Right? And they say they don't, and their subheads are, well, I'll read that to you in a second. But first, I've talked on my show a few times about your comments about the needs for Democrats to be heard by saying things that communicate to Americans that we're essentially on the same page. This is at least how I heard it, but how did you mean it, what you said?
That's exactly what I meant. I said we need to be willing to have difficult debates and not to shut people down who raise contentious issues. And if we can't do that, if we can't speak honestly to the concerns raised by a lot of working Americans, then we're just not taken seriously as a party, and we're not trusted. I think a lot of this election came down to trust. And many Americans said Democrats may have better policies, they may have a more sane leader at the head of the party, but I just don't trust these guys. And that's a big problem.
And do you think the I would say fault line of trust necessarily runs on the issue of trans girls in sports?
No, absolutely not. This is one of many examples I raised in the New York Times interview. But I think it's an example of where we just see that Democrats are out of touch because they're just not even willing to engage in these difficult issues. Why? Because we're more concerned about offending people than actually solving problems. Same thing with immigration, right? For a long time, the Democratic Party just didn't even want to acknowledge that there was a problem with the southern border. And I remember actually talking to a Democrat on the House floor, someone who was running for the position of essentially the Democratic messaging position in the House, right? Long title, but in charge of Democratic messaging. And I asked her, I said, how do you think we should handle immigration? And her answer was, we should not talk about it. Nope, shouldn't talk about it. It's just bad for immigrants if we talk about it. And a lot of Americans look at that and say, wow, these people are really out of touch.
But historically on immigration, Democrats have, I don't even know if this is historically, but as of late, Democrats have a line and a known policy position that's not too difficult to articulate. Maybe for some Democrats, it is.
I totally agree with you. I think we can win on these issues. That's my point. I think we can win on these issues. We've got to deal with the cultural problem we have where a lot of Americans think we're out of touch. We live in our elite institutions. We spend more time preaching down to people rather than listening to them. I mean, think about our attitude towards people who vote for Trump, right? Not only are you wrong, but you're a bad person for supporting this guy. I mean, that's the attitude that a lot of Americans hear from Democrats right now. And so we've got to stop this preachy culture, and we've got to be willing to listen to Americans and their concerns. And then on some issues, including some of the more difficult issues, let's just get out there and really sell our policies, because we are the party that has a reasonable policy, a bipartisan policy on immigration, when Trump is the guy who came in and deliberately sunk the deal so that he could play politics with the border. Right? That's a good argument. So why should we not engage on the issue, right? We have a good plan on the economy, but we've got to actually sell that to Americans. And when Trump ran this horrific anti-trans ad against Harris, she didn't respond. By the way, that does a huge disservice to the trans community because we're not even arguing back. We should have a more reasonable policy that the majority of Americans can get behind. Then we put that issue to bed, and we don't let the Republicans, number one, advance their hateful agenda, and number two, just badger us over the head with these issues that are damaging in elections.
What should the response have been in a 30-second ad? The equivalent of what you could say, what the Democrats do say on immigration, which is that the people who are not here legally need to get legal and go to the back of the line. That's something that Barack Obama said. That's something that probably the mainstream of the Democratic Party says. I just am not sure what the equivalent of that is in the ad addressing the trans issue. What would you say?
Well, actually, the ad was focusing on transgender surgeries for federal prisoners, and it said that the Biden-Harris administration supports this. And I think she should have just said bluntly, actually, we were just continuing the Trump administration policy, but I personally don't think we should be spending taxpayer money on that. And I don't know would it be that hard, right? It's sort of like, this is some people have brought up the comparison with the Willie Horton ad back in that Republicans used against Mike Dukakis, who, of course, is kind of personal to Massachusetts people like myself, right? And basically, they were saying that this, vicious killer in Massachusetts, deserved essentially the death penalty, and Dukakis didn't support it. And you know what? Dukakis just could have said something like, "Look, I'd love to kill this guy myself. He's so bad, but I don't believe in the death penalty." That would have been a legitimate response. Like, show some care, show some emotion, show some just honesty with how we feel, as opposed to always feeling like we have to say whatever is, interest group approved language that comports with a strict ideological framework or litmus test set by some wing of the party.
Yeah, I think the Willie Horton, there was a little bit of a confluence of two things. One was a question in the debate that Dukakis got, where he maybe should have said that to Bernard Shaw. And the Willie Horton one was he was let out on leave, and maybe Dukakis should have said, yeah, I screwed that one up. But I do want to go back to the trans sports issue, because I don't know. I identify with your remarks, which is to say to Americans, I hear what you're saying. We got to look into this. But is there the equivalent on trans girls playing sports, a 30-second ad or a quick bumper sticker slogan that communicates sensibility to the majority of Americans?
Well, first of all, we're not, just to be clear, not talking about girls, right? This isn't an issue with kids. I was never talking about trans kids. I mean, I played on co-ed soccer teams. My
right,
little
not
girls,
little kids.
We're talking about in the future, right?
Kids, right?
Women, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really trans women in women's sports. And guess what? The Olympics has restrictions. The NCAA has restrictions. So I don't think it's unreasonable for Democrats to, one, say, hey, this is a legitimate issue to actually debate, instead of just saying, no, there's no debate here. Absolutely, trans women allowed no matter what, in all circumstances. That's the Democratic Party line, apparently, as told to me, right? And instead just say, look, the Olympics has restrictions. The NCAA has restrictions. I'm not an expert on this. Like, I don't know exactly what the right answer is, but it's totally reasonable to say that that's a fair approach.
So now Nancy Mace has introduced a bill to ban Sarah McBride, who will be the first trans rep, from using the women's bathrooms on Capitol Hill. And I think that would make it the one section of Washington, D.C., the only federal controlled area to do so. Would you say that's certainly going so far? Two-part question. I'm going to guess you do. And part two is, do you think that the Republicans winning on, quote unquote, winning or having effectiveness on that Trump ad breathed into life the anti-Sarah McBride specific bathroom bill?
I think that Nancy Mace is just trying to score political points at the expense of the basic civil rights of a fellow American. And what she's really saying, Mike, is trans people don't even exist. Because if you hear her talk about it, she doesn't talk about Sarah as a trans woman, which she is. She just says this is a man. So she is denying the existence of trans women. And to me, this is actually quite analogous to the way people treated gays 50 years ago, right? They just said, no, you're not gay. You're just a deviant. You're wrong. You need to be re-educated, right? And that attitude that people who are different than us just simply don't exist is exactly the kind of attitude that Democrats need to fight against. And the interesting thing is, so I went on News Nation with a pretty conservative former Fox News host the other night, and I defended this issue. And I defended Sarah, and I attacked Nancy and said, this is wrong, and we will not stand for this in the Democratic Party. And when I talked to some colleagues afterwards about it, they're like, oh, geez, man, I can't believe you even got in that debate. The point is, a lot of Democrats just don't even want to engage in this issue. And that doesn't help Sarah McBride. That doesn't help trans people across America if we're too afraid to even touch this with a 10-foot pole, because we'll be corrected by the word police if we don't use the correct terminology.
In 2023, the House of Representatives had an exact party line vote, and a bill to ban trans girls from playing girl sports passed the House. Every Republican voted for it. Every Democrat, including yourself, voted against it. Of course, didn't get taken up given the control of the Senate. But I know the answer to this. You wouldn't have voted differently. But do you think if that vote were held next term, you would have 100% Democratic opposition to it?
Look, I think probably so, because this was a perfect example of a Republican bill that just went too far. And it's the same thing. It's the attitude that trans people don't even exist, as opposed to taking a more thoughtful approach, like the Olympics, like the NCAA. They actually go sport by sport. I've learned more about this since my comment, right? My comment was just about how we aren't even allowed to talk about this stuff, not trying to say I'm an expert on it. But that kind of measured approach is exactly what we want. But here's the point, Mike. We didn't have an opposition bill that actually put forward a reasonable approach. And maybe in exchange for a reasonable approach on trans women in sports, also codified into law their basic civil rights, their basic access to health care. When Republicans want to be able to fire people for being trans just based on what they wear to work. That's what a lot of very conservative Republicans want to do. And they're going to get away with this kind of agenda, just like they were able to get away with passing that extremist bill through the House, if we don't have a more reasonable response that the majority of Americans who do believe in civil rights, who do believe in respecting people who are different from them, can get behind. And by the way, that a few moderate Republicans can get behind when it comes down to literally counting votes and making sure that the conservative Republicans don't get away with their extremist agenda. That's how we win.
Steve Kerrigan, the Democratic State Party chair, criticized you, and last week in an interview you said he hadn't even or wouldn't even return your call on this. Has he since returned your call? Have you discussed it?
No, and I've called him several times, but I mean, this is exactly the problem. He literally won't even discuss it with me. I mean, what does that say? When a party chair will not return the call of a sitting member of Congress to just discuss an issue. You know who's returned my call, by the way? Sarah McBride. And we've just been texting, but she wants to sit down and have a meeting and talk about these issues and actually work through how to address them. Some LGBTQ leaders in the House have approached me and said, we need to have this discussion. We have too absolutist a position. And you're right, Seth. We need to be willing to debate this and come up with a more reasonable approach. So actually, there are some great leaders in the Democratic Party, including members of this community. I've had several discussions with trans people who have reached out. I've had discussions with parents of trans people who really care about this and do want to have this debate. But we need party leadership too. By the way, you know one leader in the party who absolutely agrees on this and has repeatedly assured me, Seth, you're right, we're going to have this conversation? That's Hakeem Jeffries. And he even said to me the other day, he's like, look, the backlash proves your point, Seth. That's exactly right. The backlash proves my point that we've been having trouble having this discussion. Let's get leaders in the party who are willing to have these debates and not just dismiss the concerns of a majority of Americans.
Did you ask Sarah McBride if she had any critiques of what you said or how you said it?
I did, and we haven't had a fulsome discussion because we were trying to connect before I left Washington, and she's been going through a new member orientation, so we haven't actually sat down in person yet. But I mean, I don't want to, to sort of paraphrase what she said. She said, yes, we do need to have a reasonable approach here, and I think we can come to some common ground.
Why do you think Tom Suozzi, who's a representative from Long Island, who said the equivalent things, did not get the blowback you did?
I don't know. Colin Allred in Texas literally ran ads saying what I said. But I don't know. I think partly it just comes from some of the attitude of Democrats in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is a place that is known for being rather elite, sometimes out of touch. Sometimes people with 3 Harvard degrees like myself get accused of that. And that's fair. Like, I'm very conscious of this. Like, I spend a lot of time trying to keep in touch with Marines I served with, for example, with Americans who, don't live in ivory towers and spend their time, preaching to other people and telling the rest of America why they're wrong and we're right. We need to do a lot more listening in this party, and that's certainly something I try to practice myself as a representative. After all, my job is to represent my constituents, right? Represent their views, give air to their concerns. And the Democratic Party actually has a proud history of this, right? We are the party that raises up the concerns of working Americans, brings them to Washington, and actually comes up with solutions. But when we're unwilling to do that, when we hear concerns and people and respond to people by saying, no, you didn't phrase that correctly, or that's not something you should worry about, or that's not a concern you should have as a dad, or whatever it is, we're not winning people's trust. I mean, try next week at the Thanksgiving table, right? Just responding to someone across the table from your family, from a different part of the country or whatever, who raises a contentious issue, and you don't like the way that they referred to immigrants or something like that. It's probably better to actually engage in the conversation and have a reasonable debate rather than shut them down immediately for the particular language that they use to raise the question.
I think what you pointed to about the difference between you and Swazi, relying on the makeup of Massachusetts, is absolutely correct. Of the 9 seats in Massachusetts, the closest one that was almost, I'm going to use that in quotes, won by a Republican was a 15-point victory. Whereas in New York, Swazi's seat was held by George Santos a couple of terms ago. And New Yorkers know that they have to communicate occasionally to Republicans. And perhaps in Massachusetts, that's not as important. But I think your point is the party has to communicate occasionally and often to Republicans. And it is a danger if people who don't ever have to do that hold sway over the messaging the party engages in.
I mean, look, Mike, the honest truth is we don't have to communicate to Republicans or independents if we don't want to win. We can just keep losing. But if we want to actually win elections, which in politics is the only way that you can advance your agenda, to do things like protect trans people and all the other great things on the Democratic agenda, like have an economic policy that reduces inflation instead of Trump's policy of tax cuts for billionaires and massive tariffs and massive deportations, all three of which will increase inflation, right? If you want to actually win and do good things for this country, then you've got to be able to communicate with a majority of Americans. And since you're such a great political historian, better than I am, clearly, I'll also point out that my district in Massachusetts used to be a frontline district for Democrats. That means it was a top Republican target in the entire country. And my predecessor, but the year before I beat him in a primary, he won his election by 1 point over the Republicans. So I know that I represent a lot of Republicans in my district. I know that on that first ballot, when I won election as a Democratic representative, my district voted by 13 points for our Republican governor, Charlie Baker. So I know that I do not just represent Democrats. I represent everybody, whether they voted for me or not, and I'm going to value their concerns.
Charlie Baker is now in charge of the NCAA and has to deal with the exact issue you've been talking about.
He has to deal with this issue. Yeah, lucky him.
You went on what I think I called on my show the Thus Proving My Point tour. You would do all these interviews or meet with all these organizations, and they'd yell at you for raising the point that you raised. And you would not lecture them, but you would essentially have the message, thus proving my point. But do you think that the discussion where you could say, thus proving my point, actually advances your point? Or at some point, does it become the case that your point can't get through if it's controlled or influenced by a media who's doing what they need to do and what they define as their job, but isn't hearing your point and keeps rebutting you, and you keep having to say, thus proving my point?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's not lost on me that this was like a 25-minute interview with the New York Times, and I gave a lot of examples of places where I think the Democratic Party is out of touch, but of course they picked this one quote to highlight, right? But I do think that I have been able to advance the discussion because I'm getting these commitments from Democrats in leadership position, especially fellow colleagues and colleagues in the House, who genuinely want to have this discussion and want to fix some of these problems and want to make some changes in the party so we can start winning again. I do think there are strong currents in the opposite direction, though. There are a lot of Democrats in denial right now who are making all sorts of excuses for why we lost and are not willing to make fundamental changes to ensure that we win. I think that's a huge mistake. We've got to change to win because the stakes are so high. For trans people, for people struggling to make their paychecks, for communities, families that are going to be broken up by these reckless deportations that Trump claims. The Democratic Party is the party that will save Americans. The Democratic Party is the party that will stand up for people who are going to be attacked by the Trump administration. But we can't do that very effectively if we don't win. So at the end of the day, we got to win. I'm here to win.
Seth Moulton represents the 6th Congressional District in Massachusetts. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.